when you think about a neutral interest rate, I think there's basically two different ways that you can approach it. You can approach it from a theoretical model based perspective, which is mostly how the Fed approaches this problem when they're thinking about what R star is, and or you can look at it from an empirical perspective, which is, I think, basically the way that most macro investors look at this. And when you look at it from an empirical perspective, here's the basic picture, which is that we've had interest rates at roughly this level or higher for the course of the last 2+ years on both the short end and the long end. And we've seen real GDP growth be 2 to 3% during that entire time, and nominal GDP growth be 5 to 6%, pretty stable. And so, if you look at that and you consider that, like the empirical evidence would suggest that the rates around 5 are neutral because they are the level of rates that leads to a stable set of economic conditions, for an extended period of time. Chairman Powell doesn't see it that way. I'll remind you that Chairman Powell said that interest rates above 2% were restrictive, in 2022, when he was starting the process of hiking. And so I don't think he has a lot of credibility in terms of determining what the neutral rate is. But nonetheless, it's guiding his policy, and his policy is, predominantly based upon the unfounded belief that interest rates are meaningfully restrictive at current levels.
I feel like one of the big debates is looking at like whether you believe to look at interest rates from a nominal or a real perspective. And so like a lot of the idea of restrictiveness is hung up on this idea that, oh, if you look at like real Fed funds rate, it's highly elevated from a cyclical perspective. Do you think that idea is flawed of looking at it in terms of like real Fed funds?
Yeah, I think it's probably the worst way to think about this, in from a Fed's perspective. Now, of course, do real interest rates matter? Just sort of in a general sense, of course, like the difference between 10% interest rates when inflation's 10% and 10% interest rates when inflation's 2%. Those are obviously very different paths, but that's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is the current level of interest rates, relative to inflation around 2 to 3%. And I think in a lot of ways, you don't really want to think about interest rates when you're thinking about how stimulative they are or restrictive. You don't really want to think about them relative to CPI, because CPI isn't a great indication of the ability to pay. A much better indication of an ability to pay is to think about interest rates relative to, for instance, income growth or revenue growth or profit growth. And if you think about it in that context, the current level of interest rates is looks much less elevated in the context of, say, income growth, household income growth running at 5 or 6% on an annualized basis, or revenue growth running at a 5 or 6% basis, on a 5 or 6% growth rate basis. And so when you think about it that way, the idea of being very restrictive, kind of falls away. And frankly, those measures are more in line with the empirical evidence of how restrictive those rates have actually been than looking at sort of a real rate perspective.